Boys and girls, welcome back. With today, I've got with me Jacinta Price, one of my favourite public commentators. She's got a long resume of achievements and things she's done, but I first saw her on her Mind the Gap tour, which I thought was quite fantastic, which was speaking to her wanting to bridge the Indigenous divide. She's a councillor of the Alice Springs Town Council, as well as director of the Indigenous Program at Centre for Independent Studies. And she's also got her hand in quite a few other musical, creative pursuits as well. So thanks for taking the time to come talk.
Not a problem. Thank you for having me, Dougal.
Now, you actually in Alice Springs right now?
Yes, I'm in Alice Springs. Been here since the great lockdown.
Yeah. Well, I think that might even bring like a pretty interesting perspective, because we see a lot of things happening in Sydney. I guess the first thing I want to talk about was over the past couple of weeks. Everyone's going to know this, but as my duty of the host, I'm going to have to re-say it. That Americans' cities have been basically all protesting Black Lives Matter movement. So the Black Lives Matter movement has been protesting against the death of George Floyd in particular, police violence against African Americans, and it is attributed, the allegation is, to systemic racism. And there's a big discussion taking place at the moment in America, but that discussion has shifted in the past week or so into Australia, except with the focus being put on Indigenous Australians and kind of their interactions with the justice system, and allegations against the Australian police force and justice system of racism, which accounts for kind of the quite sad statistics and the disparities between Indigenous Australians and non-Indigenous Australians' interactions with the law. So that's a mouthful. Now, Jacinta, can I ask you, what has your experience been with the police and how they interact with Indigenous communities? Because you're someone who does this all the time on a day-to-day basis. Do you feel like the police have like a positive effect, a negative effect? Are there strong elements of racism, or how do you feel?
Well, I think the police have a really tough job to fulfill, because the vast majority of them, in my experience, are decent, hardworking individuals who care deeply about the job that they have and the people that they serve. And I mean, in my own family, I have had a long line of police officers, Indigenous community police officers involved in my family. So there has always been that link and that relationship there, and most definitely a sense of pride that these individuals in my family have had those positions. My own grandfather has not worked as a police officer, but has worked with police as a police tracker and carried out important jobs like tracking down someone who has committed a murder going into the bush and finding them so they could be brought to justice. I have another relative who was another sort of grandfather to me, who in fact flew to Germany to help German police track a murderer over there. So I have a long history in my family of my Indigenous family being part of the police force. And what I've seen building up in the last few years is this encouragement of resentment toward our police officers, which makes their job really difficult to carry out in communities, especially when, you are dealing with the majority of those who are victims of crime in the Northern Territory are Aboriginal people. And the majority of that majority are Aboriginal women. So we need strong relationships with our police force in order for our mob to be protected, for the law to be upheld in their favour. Now, I absolutely refute the idea that there is systemic racism within our police force. That is rubbish, in my view. Yes, you will get, the odd racist amongst, all human beings, and they will exist there in the police force as well. in a place like Alice Springs, they won't get away with that sort of behaviour too quickly. No one really does get away with that sort of behaviour too quickly. They're pulled up fairly quickly if there's any of that kind of behaviour that might be going on. So yes, no, there isn't systemic racism, and certainly the Royal Commission into Black Deaths in Custody, the 99 deaths that were investigated, found no element of systemic racism within that report. Also found that there was no foul play or maltreatment of those deaths that were investigated. And of course, you know, protesters are now running with this figure of over 400 deaths in custody since the Royal Commission.
Mm.
And they are hammering that particular statistic without knowing the full details of each of those deaths. You know, it is based on the assumption that somehow these people were murdered, when, like the Royal Commission of Black Deaths in Custody would suggest, is that these were people who had pre-existing conditions that that led to a death. When it comes to things like suicide, obviously, you know, there is a duty of care, most definitely. But in some cases, it is just too difficult to know how to stop someone from suiciding. I mean, there's more suicides that take place, black suicides that take place outside of custody. So do we then say, you know, whoever is with that person, whoever the family members are, have a duty of care to that individual for taking their life? You know, are we going to apply the same standards in that regard? And are we going to apply the same standards when it comes to the overwhelming deaths outside of custody at the hands of other Aboriginal people? You can't have it both ways.
Well, I was having a look at some of those figures. I know the Guardian, I think, set up a project called Deaths Inside, where it was starting to look at track the deaths in custody since the Royal Commission. I think that's where they get the figure from, this over 400. And I just actually did an interview today with one of my friends who is actually protesting inside the Black Lives Matter movement in America. One of the things they're really frustrated about is when, like, police do something wrong, for example, like we see in the case of George Floyd, that they might not then be brought to, like, they might not be prosecuted, or they might not kind of get brought to justice if people don't hear about it, or if it's just, you know, some black inner city kid, how is, you know, and it's police investigating police, the incident might not be recorded, even if it does get referred to, you know, the prosecutors, and even if it does go to court, there's no, that the legal system was kind of built against bringing police people to justice, in a sense. And I think when I had a look at those statistics from the Guardian, they said there'd been no successful prosecution against police regarding, like, Indigenous deaths in custody since the Royal Commission. Do you think that there's any elements of, like, the criminal justice system and how it relates to Indigenous Australians that's in need of reform, that needs to be looked at, that's kind of making Indigenous people have a hard time?
Well, I think what you'll find is that more, you know, non-Indigenous people are die inside custody as well. And if there is most definitely an element of injustice taking place where, you know, there is leniency toward police officers, I think there are certainly definitely cases, there may be cases involving Aboriginal deaths in custody, but there'd most certainly also be cases involving non-Indigenous. And I think that's what we have to be focused on, not the racial element of it, but the injustice of where that has failed, where the system has failed in particular cases, regardless of whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. That's where I think the focus most certainly needs to be. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement, I think they do more to exacerbate racial tension than to bring people together on these particular sorts of issues. And because what I don't think is, I don't think it's as prevalent as is claimed, that these are racially motivated. And I think it is difficult in any sort of system. And I know that certainly there's difficulties in the, in the American way of doing things, and the fact that many officers, if they are trying to do the right thing themselves, are ostracized for doing that. But I don't particularly think it's based on it entirely being racially motivated issues.
Mm. Well, I think one of the well, first of all, I think it's kind of like a breath of fresh air that you can come and speak about, judging, let's say, Indigenous Australians as individuals, because I think really that's a really important thing, particularly when we talk about an issue like race. And one of the things that's kind of confused me is like this kind of new definition of racism, of like systemic racism, of these like kind of complex social structures which operate and you're a part of and you benefit from, that you kind of can't see, you can't measure it, there's no kind of statistics, but it's like a really great weapon to like shut somebody up who disagrees with you. I think coming out of that kind of social justice narrative is this idea that everyone is only the product of their environment, and the only way to change a person's life is to kind of change the environment, or like, let's say, the power structures around them. And so if some people have some like really poor or like some disparities or some life outcomes, like it must be the government's fault, and it must require like a big kind of government solution, I guess. So when you look at kind of when you look at some of those statistics, which it does make you sad to talk about, like Indigenous people being 2% of the population, but like 28% of prison population. I mean, first of all, how do we understand that? Like, how did that come to be in your eyes, and what do you think the solutions are to something like that? Because a lot of the articles I've been reading saying it's systemic racism, we need to fix systemic racism, but what do you think?
Well, blaming it on something else other than the individual and their own personal responsibility in the matter certainly provides, a situation where you might as well encourage people to go out and be violent and to commit crime, because it's not your fault. It's because of racism. It's because of systemic racism that you're faced in these poor situations. Poverty is not an excuse to commit crime. While there's a higher likelihood that you will commit crime when you come from such circumstances, but there are people who live in poverty, who've been in poverty all their lives and never committed crime, who have been able to change the direction of their lives by taking control of their lives themselves. And I think there's this horrible, there's these lowered expectations that are created around Indigenous people and self-responsibility. I mean, I've been having online arguments with people who say, oh, that police, it's their job, that they are to hold a particular standard, and we've got to hold that standard of the police, but you're not going to change individuals who commit crime. So, you've just got to accept what they do, basically, which is nonsense. If you've got a particular standard for a police officer, you should hold that particular standard for the individuals that you know in your own family. If not, hold them higher, because they are part of your community and your family, to do the right thing by the next human being. And more importantly, especially if that person is a family member to you. I mean, I've been quoting the last lot of statistics from the ABS with regard to Indigenous victims of crime being victims of assault and sexual assault. And in 2018 alone, 85% of the Northern Territory Indigenous victims of crime were victims who knew their offender. So the offender was either a family member or a partner. 50% of those victims were assaulted by a partner. And of that 50%, so altogether, that's 4,377 Indigenous victims of crime. But of that 50%, 88% were women. So that's 2,075 Aboriginal women victims of domestic violence at the hands of their partners. If we want to lower the rates of incarceration in order to avoid deaths in custody, then if we actually dealt with the issue of domestic and family violence, we would see those rates drop dramatically, because almost 70% of Aboriginal men incarcerated are incarcerated for violent crimes against their loved ones. Like, it's not rocket science. But the Black Lives Matter movement is not interested in these truths. They're not really interested in all Black lives mattering, unless, you know, you can blame a white perpetrator, or you can blame systemic racism on the cause of death of Black lives. Before this interview, I received a message from my family that my nephew in his early 30s has been murdered in the community of Wallara as a result of ongoing family feuds. And you can bet that this will not make much of a ripple in the whole argument, but there's a life that's been taken by another Black person, but it won't make a difference in the grand scheme of all of this.
I'm so sorry to hear that. A few my condolences. I think when you talk about individual responsibility, and that it has to be on the individual, let's say, committing the crimes, and they can't just blame it on systemic racism, I think it also doesn't give enough credit for those people who have gone above and beyond it and made a really good, like, responsible, productive life for themselves. I mean, you, for example, you know, a really big influence in the community and on Indigenous issues. And I think there's probably a special kind of racism reserved for you as someone who is, you know, half Aboriginal, but doesn't accept the social justice narrative. And I can imagine the same would go for your mother, Bez, who my father said is his favourite politician ever. But who my father is a secret at this point, to be released at a later date. Because I was even reading that your mother became a mother at 13, and then went in, left an abusive partner, got herself educated at university, and then was able to go and make a really successful career as you know, commentating and being an activist on Indigenous issues, being part of a government in the Northern Territory, and be really quite exceptional. Why do you think that? I know. Well, let me ask this a different way. How do you think we can encourage more people to choose that life path of self-responsibility?
Stop telling them that they're victims to begin with. Like, my mother was never told she was a victim. Like, I mean, if you think about it, she grew up inside a humpy. She was born under a tree. She grew up in a humpy. She was what you call someone who's living in poverty, but she didn't know she was living in poverty. She didn't have people telling her that you live in poverty and this is the fault of the white man and you're a victim. She was just getting on with her life. And the funny thing is, since COVID-19, she's been forced for the first time in her life to take a welfare payment, to take the job seeker payment. Yeah. She has never taken a welfare payment in her life, and she didn't want to, but she doesn't have the choice in the matter at the moment. And she's just like any other human being who has, who has not been told they're a victim, but who has lived through and grown up in poverty and understood the need that if you don't use your two hands and your brain to work, to provide for yourself and to provide for your family, because it is your responsibility to, then you will simply suffer and you will not make it and your life will be horrible. That's the mentality, that's the understanding that she's had. You know, prior to that, my grandparents grew up in the bush. They hadn't seen a white person until they were in their early adolescence. And if you want to talk about poverty, that was probably, that in the Western world, that's what you'd regard as poverty, having absolutely no material possessions whatsoever and having to live and survive off a vast desert landscape. And that's what my grandparents were doing. No one was telling them that, you know, geez, that's a tough life. And when the world changed, they learned to change with it, because you have to adapt and you have to change. Otherwise, you do suffer. You're not doing yourself any favors. And when people are taught they are victims constantly, people that are saying that, you know, people that carry on about white privilege and say, oh, you know, it's almost as if to say, I've got something that you don't have because you're not white. You know, what is that telling those people? What is it telling Aboriginal people? You are lesser because you're not white and therefore you're somehow a victim. So ultimately you remove their agency. You're not saying, hang on a second, you're human like me. Look, you know, this is how I accomplished what I did. You can do the same. You know, you're human, you're capable of doing that. Now, what they're saying is, poor thing, you know, you're black and therefore you're just instantly, you know, suffering at the hands of, you know, suffering from oppression and all these horrible things. And if only you had this magic thing that us white skinned people have to get you where we are. It's ridiculous, and it's not, it doesn't encourage people. It doesn't, you know, I mean, I don't like the idea of people empowering others. I like, you have to empower yourself. But if you're constantly told you're a victim, how the hell are you supposed to empower yourself otherwise?
Mm, mm. Well, I think that's a really powerful message, and you have to be brave to say it in a time like this. What do you think that should be the issues that the Black Lives Matter people are focusing on in Australia? You mentioned things like domestic violence. Where should we be focusing our attention if we want to improve the kind of real, tangible life outcomes and help Indigenous people in Australia who are kind of experiencing that gap? What do we need to do?
Well, I don't think it's anyone else's responsibility apart from, you know, individuals in those positions. And I think we've been doing the wrong thing for quite some time now. You know, like I hear privileged, you know, people with black privilege, like Pat Dodson,
like me especially,
and people like that. You know, they call him the grandfather of reconciliation, but at the end of his 2013 reconciliation speech, he said that you know, our history will not be forgotten and not forgiven. Well, he's completely, I don't know why he's, you know, held up as this grandfather of reconciliation when he should very well know, and especially someone who was once a former priest or studying to be a priest, that forgiveness is the key to reconciliation. And what we should be striving for and reaching for and understanding is that, you know, let's stop the racial divide. Let's stop the racial divide and let's stop creating this us and them mentality. And let's start, you know, using real reconciliation, which is sharing, which is creating understanding between one another, which is, you know, for those who have lived successful lives or lives where they've overcome adversity, that they have the ability to be able to share how they got to where they have got to without being, you know, called, one, a sellout if you're Aboriginal, or, you know, white privilege, and how can you understand if you're white, and without people like Pat Dodson saying that sharing, creating that understanding is assimilation. Ultimately, you know, it's becoming like a white person when he has probably done things that he would regard as assimilist ways of living his life to gain the successes that he has within his life. I mean, you know, the word assimilation is used as some sort of dirty word because people make connections with, you know, assimilation policy in our country's history. But all the word means is creating understanding between people. That's all the word means. And but then we've got to stop pandering to an industry that is built on the back of the misery of Aboriginal people. Because if we actually pull Aboriginal people out of misery, this industry will not exist anymore. I mean, look what happened during COVID-19. We're all in the same boat. So everyone was quiet. Where are all the black activists? And now suddenly this George Floyd issue has come up, and bang, you know, all these activists that were lying dormant in COVID-19 have had a sprinkling of water, and they've come back to life, and they've shot back up to appease themselves. That's all I see as an attempt to appease themselves, and somehow be fulfilled. If there's no drama, if there's no creating racial divide, then these individuals don't feel useful.
So it seems to me like you don't have a very high regard for the protests that are happening in major cities at this point. The protest that was supposed to happen in Sydney on Saturday got cancelled, but what do you say about those protests?
When are you going to protest about black on black violence? When are you going to protest about the 2,075 women, Aboriginal women back in 2018 who were victims of domestic violence? You know, when are you going to protest about improving our family lives ourselves and taking responsibility and lifting expectations instead of maintaining low expectations of Aboriginal people? When are you going to protest about all those things? Because while, you know, you're out and about, you might make yourselves feel good and feel worthy and feel, you know, virtuous, but you're not achieving anything in the grand scheme of things.
Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your day. I feel pretty happy to have got you for the time already, but I do want to ask you one more question about how Alice Springs is coping with COVID-19. Is it affecting you a lot or not really?
It's affecting me in positive ways. I've learned how to become a gardener. Sorry. It's not been, I think we've been very, very lucky in the Northern Territory, given the fact that we had very little cases to start off with, and then we had none before the rest of the country. And, you know, there were concerns, obviously, if it got into the Indigenous community, then it had been disastrous, absolutely disastrous. And there were also concerns that, you know, some people trying to dodge police and go around backtracks to get back into Alice Springs to get alcohol and then go back into the community. There was that going on, but it was stamped out pretty quickly. It has been stamped out pretty quickly. I think generally Territorians are pretty happy and pleased with the fact that we have been one of the most, you know, safest places in the world when it's come to the pandemic. And, you know, there was a ridiculous article in NITV claiming that if there were to be inaction and you know, lots and lots of deaths as a result in remote communities, then you could liken it to genocide. Well, I'm pleased that absolutely, you know, there's not been a single Aboriginal death as a result, because that would have been another way to set off the protesters. And clearly, it has demonstrated how we've been able to come together as a nation. In Alice Springs, our community have come together to support one another, to support businesses that have been affected. You know, people getting online and setting up Facebook pages so that if you needed things delivered to your house or you needed support, that was happening. So it's drawing out a lot of goodness within the community, which is great for me, because there are moments there I'm like, oh, I can't stand this place anymore. But it's certainly been good in that regard. However, and crime's managed to has managed to go down as well, especially alcohol-related crime. I've been pleased because there have been family members of mine who were forced to go back out into community who would otherwise be in Alice Springs drinking, and, you know, really in unhealthy proportions. But what I am a little bit concerned about is the biosecurity zones have been lifted as of today. So we will probably see a huge influx of people coming in from remote communities. There'll be those who'll be wanting to drink heavily. And yeah, I think the community is now bracing ourselves for that influx. So we're hoping that we won't go back to normal in that regard. But we can only wait and see.
Mm. Well, that's one of the things it did cross my mind was it would be frightening if you had a whole lot of Indigenous people who got together for a protest and then they ended up all getting the disease. That would be crazy. But
Absolutely.
but one thing you did say there sparked my interest a little bit. Do you have much to do with NITV?
Only when they want to paint me in a not so very nice light, usually.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I know there are definitely people there who really don't like me and really don't want for my voice to be heard. And when I have had pieces published through them, you know, they've had to be had to be written in a particular way that it isn't going to trigger, you know, their readers and such. But I don't think they're doing Aboriginal people a favour necessarily, because they don't promote a wide range of views, Aboriginal views. They have one particular way of viewing a lot of these issues, and I find it quite divisive, and I don't think it's helpful. One thing I can say, actually, what I'm noticing more about the US is the fact that more and more Black people, conservatives, are standing up and voicing their opinions and saying, you know, especially after that Biden comment, "You ain't Black," you know, like that is the mentality of the left. And that's the mentality of NITV, unfortunately. You know, if you're Black, well, then you vote for Labor. Or if you're hardcore Blacktivist, you vote Green. And that's the mentality. Unfortunately, I'd like to see more Aboriginal conservatives stand up like these, you know, Black conservatives in the US and be proud to be who you are. But I know that there's a fear amongst them that they will cop it. Like, I mean, you know, the way I cop it. But for me, I'm lucky. My family support me. They get behind me. For a lot of Aboriginal people, their families themselves will attack them and try to bring them down for not maintaining mob mentality. So yeah, and I don't think the NITV do any favors in that regard.
Well, when I was talking to my buddy in America, I was telling him I was about to interview you, and I said she's kind of like the Australian version of Candace Owens, and I was wondering, she's leading this kind of Blexit movement in America to kind of separate the partnership in some type of way between, like, let's say the Democratic establishment and like Black voters and they just take the Black votes for granted and don't really do much. I mean, you even look at Obama as the senator for Chicago, Illinois, and the Chicago crime rates, you know, haven't changed. Do you think there might be hope for like a similar movement of like self-empowerment of the Aboriginal community in Australia?
I do absolutely have hope that will be the case. I mean, I think for African Americans, I mean, obviously our situation is much closer to Native Americans, right, which you don't hear much of at all.
That's true.
But, you know, we always tend to draw similarity between African Americans. But I think that given, you know, Australia's history is fairly recent, we're still growing up. I think we've got to reach that point where we can rightly take our place and have our own opinions and think for ourselves publicly. There's still a ways to get there. I'm going to continue being, you know, even if I'm one of those rare voices, I'll continue to do so. And I encourage, because I get a lot of messages from Aboriginal people around the country who say, you know what, I'm sick of being silent. I've had enough of it, and I've watched what you're doing, and I'm going to start doing what you're doing in my community. So it's happening. And I get a lot of people say, you know, I want to support you privately. I agree with all the things that you say, but I can't say them publicly because I know I'll cop it. Or, you know, I've got a particular position in an organisation where if I speak out, I'll very likely be bullied or lose my job, you know, which is ridiculous. But yeah, I know things are going to change eventually. We've just got to get there. We've just got to take those baby steps and get there.
Well, that's a great message of hope. Well, I appreciate you coming on the Carnage House, Jacinta Price. I really hope to God it's not the last time. I love the work you're doing. Wish you had 100 more like you. We'll direct people to your Facebook page and your other social medias. Is there anywhere else you want people to follow you in particular if they want to see what you're doing?
Just Centre for Independent Studies.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll link that as well. Well, thanks very much for coming on, Jacinta. If you want to support the Carnage House, obviously you can subscribe, like the video, comment. You can see us on Facebook, Instagram. If you really like us, you want to pay us some money, we do have a Patreon account, but I'm not going to press you on that.
Wait till payday. No worries.
Payday. Hopefully, we'll sign up the Carnage House for ScoMo bucks. Hopefully, but otherwise, we'll see you soon. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.